David. It's so good to see everyone here today. Welcome, everyone, to the very first of CS50's New Year's seminars. As David mentioned, today we'll be introducing the programming language Python. So if you've never programmed before, this will be an opportunity to see what it's all about and to get your hands, get some experimenting with writing your very first programs. So while I'm presenting, definitely feel free to ask any questions in the Zoom chat. If you go down to the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll probably see a button that says chat, which you can click to say hello to other classmates and ask questions if you have any. We have a fantastic group of mentors that are here in the meeting with us today that are here to help answer questions too. And in addition to that, we also have Ed, which David mentioned as another platform where you can ask your questions. And I'll go ahead and paste that link into the chat now. So feel free to go there in order to ask questions as well, and the staff can definitely be around to help you there too. Before we get started, as was mentioned in the email, but if you haven't already, be sure to sign up for a GitHub account if you don't already have one. You'll use your GitHub account as a means of signing in to some of the course's tools. And if you go on to take CS50 after the fact, you'll do a little more work with GitHub itself. So you can go to github.com/join, the link to which I just pasted into the chat, to join GitHub if you don't already have an account. And we're going to be spending most of today inside of an IDE, or Integrated Development Environment, called CS50 IDE. And all that means is it's a tool that lives in the cloud, which will be a place where you can write and run Python programs on the internet. And so we'll get an opportunity to explore that if you've never used it before. But what you can do is go to this URL here that I've just pasted into the chat, ide.cs50.io. And once you go there, you can sign in with your GitHub username. And in a moment, I'll introduce that platform to you, show you how to use it, and we'll go about writing our very first Python programs. And so with that, let's go ahead and dive into a taste of Python. So in a moment, once you go to ide.cs50.io and sign in with your GitHub username, you should ultimately end up seeing an environment that looks something like this. This is CS50 IDE, which is a cloud-based platform where you can write and run code, and that's what we're going to be using today in order to write programs in this programming language called Python. Now, it's possible to run Python programs just on your own computer without using CS50 IDE, but today, with so many students, to make sure everyone's on the same page, we're using CS50 IDE to make sure everyone's in a consistent environment, to make sure everyone's seeing the same thing at the same time. And so over here on the left-hand side of CS50 IDE, this is our file browser. Any of the files that we create and add to our IDE, they will appear here. Right now, if you've never used CS50 IDE before, this is probably empty. But over time today, we're going to be adding some more files, and you'll be adding some more files to this yourself too. Up in this top panel of CS50 IDE is the text editor. This is where we're actually going to be writing our Python code. And then down below is what we call the terminal window. This is a place where we're going to be writing text-based commands telling our IDE what we want it to do. So ultimately, we're going to be writing code in this top section here. And then down below, we're going to write commands in order to actually run that Python code as well. And so I see that a couple people, if you're finding that the IDE is taking a bit of time to load, just give it some time to load until you see this screen. But certainly if you're having any trouble, feel free to make a post on Ed or post in the chat, and the mentors can definitely help out with whatever challenges you might be having. And otherwise, you can feel free to follow along with what I'm doing here. And so to start writing our very first Python program, I'm going to go up to the File menu in CS50 IDE and click on New File. We're just going to create a new empty text file. And this text file is going to be where we're going to start by writing our very first Python program. And the simplest of Python programs we're going to write is going to look something like this. I can write print and then hello world. And I'm going to actually save this file first. I'm going to go to File, Save. And I'm going to save this in a file called hello.py. That .py extension is just a convention. When you're writing programs in Python, they'll very often end with .py. That way we in the computer will know that it is in fact a Python program. So I'm going to name this file hello.py, and I'm going to click on Save. And this again is my very first Python program. It is one line of code. And the way to decipher this, the way to read this, as you might imagine, this program is going to print, in other words, display to the screen, the words hello world. And the way this works is I've written this word print. This is what we in the programming world would call a function. It is some code that is going to run, that is going to perform some task. And the task that this function print performs is that it prints or displays some text to the screen. And in between these parentheses that come after the word print comes the input to the function. Functions can take input, some information that the functions use. And right now, the input that I'm providing to the print function inside of these quotation marks are the words hello world. These are the words that I want to be displayed to the screen when I run this program. And so once I've written this program, I write it in this top section inside of this file called hello.py. I need to be sure to save the file if you haven't already by going to File and then Save. Now I can actually run this program. And the way that you run a program is by going into the terminal window, which is in this bottom half of cs50 IDE. And here I can write commands that my computer, that my cs50 IDE is going to follow. And the command I'm going to use here is a command called Python, which is a command that will run a Python program. And then after the word Python, I'm going to specify the name of the file that I want to run. And you might recall that the file that I opened from before is a file called hello.py. This is the file where I've been writing this code so far. And so I'm going to write Python, then a space, and then hello.py as the name of the file that I would like to run. And it's going to be a Python program. And once I've written that command, Python space hello.py, I can just press the return button to run this program. And what you'll see if you've been following what I've done is you'll see the words hello world printed to the screen. And so I'll give you all a moment to try and copy what I've done here. All I've done so far is go to ide.cs50.io. I've created a new file by going to File, New File, inside of which I've just written one line of code, print, and then in parentheses, the words hello world in quotation marks. I've saved that in a file called hello.py. And then down here in the terminal window, I've written the command Python hello.py to run that Python program. And that is going to cause the IDE to run my Python code, reading it one line at a time, top to bottom. Right now, there's just one line of code inside of my program. And that one line of code prints the words hello world to my terminal screen. All right, I'll give everyone a moment to try that for themselves. All right, so let's try to do something a little bit more interesting now. We've seen now one line of code, one line of Python code that uses this function called print. And print is a function that's built into Python. It's part of Python itself. And so once you start using Python, you'll be able to use this print function that was written by the developers of Python that we can use to display information to the screen. But there are other functions that are part of Python as well that we can use inside of our Python programs. And another function is called the input function. And the input function is a function that asks the user, whoever is running your program, to type in some input that they're going to provide to the program. And so we'll see a look at that in a moment too. I see a question asked about whether you need a semicolon at the end of the line. Turns out in Python, that's not necessary. If you've programmed a little bit before, maybe C in languages like C or Java, for example, you might have put semicolons at the end of all of your lines that are printing things out, for example. In Python, we don't need those semicolons. In Python, here we just have to say the name of the function print, and then in parentheses, hello world. But that's an excellent question, so thank you for asking that. So let me try now creating another program that's going to use this other function called the input function so that we can see how that input function works as well. So I'll go ahead and go to the File menu and create another new file. And this file I'm going to save by going to File, Save. I'm going to call this file greet.py. And you'll see why in a moment. But inside of this new program, greet.py, I'm going to, instead of using the print function, which would print out some text to the screen, which we've already seen, we're going to use the input function. And here I'm going to have a prompt asking the user to type something in as input. And the prompt I'm going to use is something like, what's your name? And then I'll include a space in a moment for reasons you'll see in just a second. And again, this text could be anything you want. You can write whatever text you want in between those quotation marks. In Python and in programming more general, any text inside of quotation marks is called a string. A string is just a fancy word for some text like words or sentences or paragraphs. And here, this string, which is in quotation marks, is just asking a question, what's your name? And because it's in the input function, that is going to prompt the user to type in some input. In this case, I'm prompting the user to type in their name, for example. And I'm seeing a couple people in the chat that are having some trouble loading cs50 IDE. If you are having trouble loading cs50 IDE, my recommendation would be to first make sure you're using the latest version of Google Chrome or Firefox. If you're using a different browser or using an older version of one of those browsers, you'll probably have the best luck with cs50 IDE by using the latest version of Chrome or Firefox. And the other thing you'll want to check is make sure that any ad blockers or other browser extensions, if you have those turned on, be sure to disable those for using cs50 IDE, just to maximize the chances that you'll be able to get in without any problems. And if you're still having issues, try reloading the IDE or asking a question in the chat, and the staff and the mentors will be around to try to help you with that as well if you're struggling. But if you are having problems, you're also welcome to just follow along with what I'm writing in my IDE, and then you can try it in your own IDE after the fact if you would like to. So if you are having trouble with the IDE, those might be good suggestions for trying to fix that. But let's turn our attention now back to this program greet.py, where I'm writing this function input, asking the question, what's your name? And let's now try this. This program's not done yet. There's more that I want to do with this program. But one strategy that I use when writing programs is not to try writing many, many lines all at once and then run it, but to build my programs a little bit at a time. And in a moment, I'll give you all an opportunity to try writing some programs of your own. And I'd recommend following that same strategy. Write everything a little bit at a time and try it as you go. And so here, I'm going to, in my terminal window, write Python, and then the new file that I would like to run, which in this case is greet.py. That was the name of the file that I just created. And when I run Python greet.py, I see printed to the screen, what's your name? And notice that my cursor is now right next to what's your name after a space. This is why I included the space up here on this very first line of my program. And my program is now paused. It's waiting for me, the user of this program, to provide some input to the program. So it's asking me, what's your name? And so I'll go ahead and type in my name, and you can do the same thing typing in your name. I'll type in Brian down here at the terminal. And then I'll just go ahead and press return to send that input to the program. And at that point, what you'll notice is that this $ appears again. This $ is just called the prompt. The prompt is telling you, you can type in another command to the program now. And usually when you see the prompt after running a Python program, that means the Python program is over. You've run the Python program, it's run to completion, and the prompt means the program is now done, and you can now run another program if you would like to by running Python followed by whatever file name you would like to run. And so this greet.py program now is asking the user to type in some input, and we can type in some input, but we're not yet doing anything with that input. I would like for my program to be able to do something like, when I say my name is Brian, maybe my program can respond to me and say like, hello, Brian, for example, using whatever it is that I typed in as input and using that later inside of the program. And so here we're going to introduce a new idea. We're going to introduce the notion of a variable. A variable in Python is just going to be some place where we can store information. Oftentimes our programs are going to want to store information that they're going to use later inside of that program. You might imagine if you're writing a program that's going to be like a calculator that can do math, you might want variables to keep track of what numbers you're adding or multiplying or subtracting. And in this program where we are asking the user for their name, we probably want some variable where we're going to store whatever it is the user typed in, whatever name the user provided as input. So how do we create a variable in Python? Well, the first thing we need to do is decide on what we're going to call that variable. And we can choose to call the variable whatever we want, but it's usually helpful to give it a descriptive name, some name that's going to be meaningful or something you'll remember later on in your program. And so because I want to use this variable to store the name of whoever is using my program, I'm just going to call this variable name. And so what I'll change in line 1 is I'm going to say name equals, and then this input line that I had before. So all I've done is add name equals to the beginning of this line. And so now what this line of code is saying is I'm going to ask the user for some input, prompting them to type in their name by asking what's your name, and then waiting for the user to type in their name. And then this equals is what in Python we call assignment. It means we are going to assign whatever was typed in by the user to this variable name. We're going to take whatever the user typed in and store it inside of this variable that we are here calling name. I see a question, do we need to initialize the variable? And so if you're familiar with other programming languages, not to worry if you haven't programmed in other languages before, you might be familiar with having to like initially say what type of variable any variable name is. In Python, you don't have to do that. The only thing you need to do to create a new variable is have the name of the variable, choose whatever name you want to give it, then an equal sign saying, this is what I want this variable to be equal to, and then what do I want it to be equal to? Well, I want it to be whatever comes back when I ask the user to type in their name. And so now I can use that variable called name, inside of my program. And so what I'm going to do is on line 2, we now have a program that has multiple lines of code, and that's okay. What's going to happen is that our computer is going to read these lines of code one after another in sequence. Let's go ahead and print hello, and then a comma. And now let me, on another line for now, let me print name. And notice name here is not in quotation marks because I don't want to literally print out the characters N-A-M-E, but I instead want to print out whatever the contents of this variable name is. Whatever is stored inside of that variable, that is what I want to have printed to the terminal. All right, so what I can do now is go ahead and run Python greet.py again. I see that it prompts me again for what's my name. I can type in my name, Brian, and now I see printed on from line 2, I see hello, comma, and then after that I see printed the name Brian. And I see a couple other people that are saying they were having trouble accessing the IDE. If you are, you can also try going to sandbox.cs50.io, which has been suggested by a couple people in the chat. That will open up a very similar programming environment to the one I see here. It's not going to be exactly the same, but you'll notice many similar elements. You'll notice that you'll have a file browser where you can have some files. You'll notice a place where you can type your code inside of a file text editor, and you'll also notice a terminal window down below where you can run these commands. Ultimately, it should behave in exactly the same way, but it just might look a little bit different to what it is that I'm seeing here, but certainly okay to be using sandbox.cs50.io if you would like in order to follow along here as well. All right, so I can try this again.